London's collapse never began with a scream or a headline. It began quietly, without drama, in the overlooked corners of a sprawling city that never truly sleeps. The European outbreak did not have a single origin point. There was no mythical first victim. Instead, several threads of disaster wove together in the same few hours, forming a knot that would tighten around the city until it strangled it. The first confirmed exposure occurred at 2:19 a.m. on September 14th in East London. CCTV footage from a 24-hour off-license on Mile End Road showed a homeless man staggering into frame. His gait was uneven, his body slack as if the joints no longer held together properly. Blood soaked through the left sleeve of his jacket. At first, investigators assumed he had been stabbed or had fallen into broken glass. Later forensics showed that the wound on his shoulder had been inflicted by human teeth. Two university students from Queen Mary passed by and saw the man collapse. One of them, a 21-year-old named Tom Willis, approached to check on him. On the footage, Tom leans down, says something, and touches the man's arm. The man's head snapped sideways with a speed impossible for his condition. His jaw clamped onto Tom's cheek. A large piece of flesh tore away as Tom fell backward, blood pulsing down his neck. Shock froze him. No scream, just his hands rising slowly to his face in disbelief. His friend shoved the attacker away, but the man didn't react like someone drunk or injured. He fell like a corpse, heavy and limp, limbs locking then unlocking as if driven by crude, disconnected impulses. Paramedics arrived at 2:26 and transported Tom to Royal London Hospital. The attacker, still convulsing on the pavement, was also taken in. That should have been the end of it. A tragic assault, perhaps a violent drug incident, treated and forgotten. But the pathogen was already inside Tom, silently overrunning every defensive line in his body. Hospital records from that night show confusion, contradictory notes, and several missing time entries. Tom's condition deteriorated within minutes. The bite wound showed premature necrosis around the edges. His heart rate spiked, then nosedived. Nurses described a strange sweetness in his breath, a metallic tang that clung to the air. No fever, no delirium, no warning signs recognized in any medical manual. Tom went into cardiac arrest at 3:11. Resuscitation began immediately. Standard procedure, compressions, oxygen, defibrillation. He never returned to life, not in any human sense. At 3:29, after 18 minutes of failed CPR, the attending doctor was seconds from calling the time of death. Tom's chest rose sharply as if he had taken a sudden, forceful breath. His eyes opened, unfocused and glassy. His arms jerked. He fell sideways off the gurney and landed on his hands and knees. A nurse stepped forward, thinking it was a seizure. Tom lunged, jaws snapping onto her throat, tearing skin and muscle away in a wet, ripping motion. She managed one gargled cry before collapsing. Security arrived late and unprepared. 3 more staff members were bitten. 2 died on the floor within minutes. All of them reanimated in less than 20 minutes. The A and E wing was sealed at 3:55. but the infection had already left the hospital. Multiple people who encountered the original attacker had walked in and out of the building hours earlier. Dozens more had been exposed in the waiting room, touching Tom, helping him, brushing past the man who bit him, unaware that any saliva entering a small abrasion or cut on their skin was enough to start the chain reaction. London's downfall was not loud or immediate. It spread through routine channels, hospital corridors, buses, pavements, the underground, carried by people who did not yet know they were dying. The nature of the pathogen allowed this. Medical teams would later identify the following characteristics. Incubation, 3 to 5 hours after a bite. Collapse, sudden cardiac arrest, no fever, no confusion, no preliminary symptoms. Reanimation, 10 to 20 minutes after clinical death. Mobility, full use of limbs driven by basic motor impulses. Cognition, none. Only primitive behavior remained. Pain response, non-existent. Respiration, absent. Movement powered by anaerobic muscle operation until tissue breakdown. This combination was designed for perfect concealment during the infectious window. People kept working, walking, taking trains, sitting in offices, going home. They felt tired or nauseous, nothing more. They died quietly, often alone or in public, and then rose wherever they fell. London's public transport network was seeded early and thoroughly. The first major reanimation outside the hospital occurred at 4:02 a.m., when an infected university student died in a waiting area full of night shift workers and commuters arriving early. Another outbreak occurred on a night bus traveling between Aldgate and Paddington. A man slumped sideways in the back row around 4:45. Witnesses assumed he had passed out. When he reanimated minutes later, 5 passengers were bitten before they could escape. Those passengers dispersed across the city, each carrying the infection into new neighborhoods. At 7:40 a.m., during the start of the morning commute, a man in a business suit collapsed on a Piccadilly Line train between Green Park and Earl's Court. Passengers tried helping him up. He turned on them instead, ripping into the nearest woman's face. Her screams triggered panic. Someone pulled the emergency brake. The train ground to a halt in a tunnel. Darkness, crowded space, confusion. No way out. By the time rail operations responded, at least 8 new infections had occurred in that single carriage alone. Above ground, similar scenes played out across the city. Ambulance crews responded to dozens of calls labeled as assaults or seizures. Police dealt with scattered attacks involving biting. Word had not yet reached them about the true danger. Officers attempted restraint techniques that only brought them close to the infected. EMTs leaned over dying victims who would rise moments later. Hospitals were already triaging bite victims as violent assault cases. They treated them like trauma, not carriers of a highly lethal pathogen. They moved them through crowded wards, into elevators, into common rooms. By noon, Royal London Hospital, St. Thomas's, King's College, and at least 3 others had experienced internal outbreaks. The UK government still believed the situation was a localized violent behavior event. They suspected narcotics. They suspected mass hysteria. They suspected anything except the dead coming back. At 9:15 a.m., the worst event of the second day quietly unfolded at Heathrow Airport. Air France Flight 1780 departed with a man in seat 27B who had been bitten at King's Cross the night before. Bite wound hidden by his sleeve, dismissed as an accident. He died partway through the flight. Reanimated shortly after. The cabin crew attempted CPR. Both were bitten. 2 passengers were bitten in the struggle. The plane landed in Paris with 3 reanimated bodies held down by panicked travelers. French responders boarded the aircraft without understanding what they were walking into. By the time they realized, it was too late. Europe was infected before the UK even accepted what was happening. Meanwhile, London worsened by the hour. Panic spread on social media. Emergency calls flooded the system. Police were overwhelmed. Hospitals locked down. Army units were requested but not immediately deployed. By late afternoon, the infection rate in London was doubling roughly every 90 minutes. At 10:20 a.m., the government issued the first public advisory. Remain indoors. Avoid hospitals. Stay calm. Almost no one obeyed. Many never received the message. Many were already infected. As evening fell, fires burned across parts of the city. Cars were left abandoned in intersections. People fled on foot or barricaded themselves in flats. The infected wandered slowly, without hurry or hesitation, drawn by movement and sound. London was no longer a functioning city. It was a maze filled with growing pockets of the dead and terrified clusters of the living. And throughout the night, flights continued leaving Heathrow. Buses continued crossing borders. Ferries continued landing in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By dawn of the next day, the outbreak was no longer a British problem. It had become a European one. The second day of the outbreak, September 15th, began with a fragile illusion of control. Government officials still believed the events of the night before were containable. The public advisory that went out shortly after sunrise told Londoners to stay indoors and avoid unnecessary travel. It sounded calm, measured, and reassuring. No mention of infection. No mention of reanimation. No mention of the dead attacking the living. But London was already slipping. Tens of thousands of people either never saw the advisory or ignored it. Morning commutes had already started. Delivery vans, buses, taxis, cyclists, school runs. Normal life continued, even as the city's vascular system filled with unreported casualties, hidden bite victims, panicked witnesses, and silent incubators. Within hours, every part of London's emergency response infrastructure began to buckle. The police, fighting the wrong battle. The Metropolitan Police were the first major institution to falter. From 6 a.m. onward, 999 calls spiked with reports of violent assaults involving biting, neighbors attacking each other, Commuters collapsing on platforms, then rising to attack those helping them. Motorists crashing and then crawling from the wreckage not as victims, but as attackers. Dispatchers, overwhelmed, still labeled these incidents as drug-related psychotic breaks or mass panic. Officers responded initially with standard, non-lethal force. They used batons, tasers, pepper spray, control holds. It was what the training manuals demanded. It was also suicide. One of the earliest body cam recordings recovered shows two officers entering a terraced home in Brixton after neighbors reported screaming. Inside, they found a man hunched over his partner's body. Blood soaked the floor around him. When he turned his head toward them, half of his face was missing. He charged with a speed entirely inconsistent with the state of his injuries. The first officer used a taser. It did nothing. The figure spasmed, then continued forward. The second officer fired a warning shot into the floor, then a second into the attacker's torso. No effect. Only when a final accidental shot struck the head did the movement stop. The officers radioed in. Headshots seemed to drop them. But that fragment of truth took hours to circulate and wasn't made official until far too late. The hospitals, where the infection multiplied. No institution suffered more on day 2 than the NHS. Hospitals were built to save the dying, not to defend against them. The concentration of bite victims created perfect conditions for reanimation clusters. Several key facilities fell in sequence. Royal London Hospital. Already weakened from day 1, it saw 24 bite victims die between morning and noon. Many reanimated while unattended. Orderlies tried to restrain them. Nurses tried to sedate them. Paramedics brought in new casualties unaware of the danger. Each room that fell contaminated the next. Within hours, the hospital was effectively lost. St. Thomas's Hospital. The chain reaction here was faster. 23 patients from various incidents were moved into a shared isolation ward. They died within minutes of each other. One reanimated on a gurney and attacked a doctor. Others followed. The ward was sealed, but not before dozens were infected. King's College Hospital. Security footage showed a single collapse in a corridor turning into a mass casualty event as nurses, visitors, and staff tried to help. In every case, the infected waited just long enough for someone to kneel down before tearing into them. By afternoon, half a dozen London hospitals had become tombs. The army deploys. Operation Reprieve. At 11:30 a.m., Britain finally mobilized the army under Operation Reprieve. Soldiers deployed to secure key infrastructure, protect hospitals, and assist evacuations. But military planning requires clarity, and none existed. The army was told only that mass violence had erupted across London, caused by a neurological contaminant inducing extreme aggression. Not that the infected did not respond to pain, not that they did not need oxygen, not that they would rise again after death unless their brains were destroyed. In the early operations, soldiers approached clusters using riot tactics, shields, warning shots, controlled lines. Many died. A platoon near Camden was overrun after attempting to corral a group of infected individuals inside a fenced courtyard. The infected pushed through the fence, pulled soldiers to the ground, and began biting any exposed flesh. The screams echoed through several streets. Another unit near Lewisham attempted a rescue inside a small housing estate. They entered 3 buildings in formation and found dozens of reanimated victims trapped inside flats with civilians. The fighting was close quarters, frantic and messy. Dozens more were bitten. As casualties mounted, commanders pivoted. By 2 p.m., soldiers began using headshots as standard practice. But ammunition is finite. Fatigue is inevitable. Once a soldier fell, the infection multiplied. The M25, the last defensive line. By late afternoon, it became clear that London could not be saved. The decision, never formally announced to the public, came from a closed military and governmental meeting. London was lost. Containment needed to happen outside the city. The M25 orbital motorway, encircling Greater London, was designated the last defensible perimeter. Checkpoints formed at major junctions. Trucks and buses were overturned to block roads. Sandbag positions went up quickly. Armored vehicles patrolled the ring. Helicopters scanned for mass movements. But the infected did not travel in predictable waves. They moved slowly, individually, spreading outward wherever opportunity allowed. By 10 p.m., the infected reached the M25 in multiple sectors. In some places, soldiers held. In others, frightened civilians tried to force their way through the barricades, creating chaos that allowed the infected to slip past. The objective wasn't to retake London. It was to stop the infection leaving it. It did not work. The rest of the UK begins to suffer. As London collapsed, other cities began reporting outbreaks. Birmingham. A bite victim from London took a train north. He died in a carriage. When he rose, panic spread. Passengers fled onto platforms. The infection seeded instantly. Manchester. A bus arriving from the south carried an infected driver who collapsed at the station. He reanimated inside a crowd. Within minutes, dozens had been bitten. Glasgow and Edinburgh. Both cities received passengers from London via rail and air. By dusk, hospitals in both cities were reporting unexplained violent attacks. Cardiff. Public panic during a rugby match caused a stampede that turned deadly when a single reanimation occurred among the crowd. By the end of day 2, every major UK city except remote areas in Scotland and Wales had reported early-stage clusters. Meanwhile, Europe ignites. While Britain focused inward, the real disaster had already taken root abroad. The flights leaving Heathrow carried more than luggage and passengers. They carried the infection. France. Paris was hit first and hardest. Three separate planes from London landed with infected passengers or crew. French police dispatched to Charles de Gaulle Airport attempted to detain violent individuals, but were overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous reanimations. Trains leaving the airport carried infected people into the city. Clusters erupted in metro stations within hours. By afternoon, Paris had mirror events of London. Hospitals falling, police overwhelmed, civilians panicking. Belgium. Brussels received a Eurostar with bodies on board. Authorities mistook it for a gas leak. Responders entered the carriage without protection and were attacked almost immediately. Netherlands. Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport suffered multiple reanimations in passenger terminals. The infection moved quickly into the city through buses and trains. Germany. Germany responded more quickly and effectively, issuing headshot protocols within hours of their first confirmed reanimation. But with incoming flights and trains from multiple infected countries, Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich still saw major outbreaks. Spain and Italy. Barcelona and Rome received infected tourists from London by midday. Crowded tourist zones became the first battlegrounds. Scandinavia. Denmark attempted to close its border early, but it did so after thousands had already crossed by road. Sweden's first outbreak erupted in Stockholm's central station. Norway and Finland acted faster, but still saw cases appear at ports and airports. Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states began closing borders quickly, but several infected individuals had already arrived through tourism and business travel. Greece. Mainland Greece suffered outbreaks in Athens due to returning travelers. Several islands imposed emergency quarantines, and some of those decisions would save entire communities. The world has no time. By the evening of the second full day, Europe was no longer dealing with isolated incidents. Multiple countries were facing collapse-level chain reactions. Millions were fleeing. Millions more were trapped in spreading zones of infection. Governments were still giving calm statements, still urging order, still promising containment. They didn't understand the truth yet. The outbreak was already on several continents, and the next to face it was the United States.